According to the Economic Policy Institute, from 2015 to 2022, the number of minors employed in violation of child labor laws increased by 283%. 283%. And the number of minors employed in violation of hazardous occupation orders increased by 94%. When I first saw these numbers, I was pretty sure I was reading them wrong. 283% feels impossible. 94 feels like it's pushing it. But these are the numbers. This is the world that we are living in. I remember really clearly driving across the country with Caitlin in 2021 and stopping at a drive-thru to get food and thinking that the person in the window was barely tall enough to reach through it. Looked like they were about 12. Might have been older than that, might not. I almost didn't want to spend the money I had already spent. I wanted to back up to where they had taken my card and say, no, I will not be doing this. But we had to keep going. A lot of people in my family started working when they were quite young. My mother started working at McDonald's when she was 13, which was normal for when and where she was, but meant that after she was 12, there was no more childhood. There was working, providing for herself and her siblings, and there has only been working ever since. Not a lot of space to think about who you are or what you want. Not a lot of space to focus on joy, just productivity. As it happens, founder of ethical culture, Felix Adler, was also a founding member and the first chairman of the National Child Labor Committee. It is interesting because I often think of Adler as this wealthy guy with wealthy friends, but he made some good use of that positionality. He made some good use of knowing captains of industry and convincing them to join him in funding work in opposition to child labor. The National Child Labor Committee worked to expose child labor and support legislation legally protecting children against labor exploitation. And though Adler died before some of the biggest pieces of this work got done, his work was foundational to the creation of the National Child Labor Committee, whose work was ultimately so important in the passing of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which defined oppressive child labor as any form of employment for children under the age of 16 and any particularly hazardous occupation for children ages 16 to 18. But Adler actually went further than just campaigning for legislation that would reduce child labor or prohibit child labor. He believed that it wasn't enough to pass laws, that you actually had to hit the people who would hire child labor, which they saw as simply cheap labor, in their pockets where they were actually paying attention. He thought that by refusing to let the rich simply grab as much money as they could, a thing that kind of encourages you to pay people as little as possible, and you can pay children less than adults because what do they know? Adler thought that A solution to this would be to put a cap on income with a 100% tax on any income above a certain level. He said, when a certain high and abundant sum has been reached, amply sufficient for all the comforts and true refinements of life, it was time to say that that money needed to go back to the people. That's a pretty radical vision, full stop, actually. It's a radical vision for now. It was an incredibly radical vision for a Victorian man whose contemporaries were other wealthy men. This is a strong stand. And something we might want to think about again. As the AEU and ethical culture reach for a new understanding of who we are, what it means to do this thing, child labor seems both an easy to agree on and really vital point to pay attention to. That increase of 283% comes not only with those violations, but with laws around the country being introduced and in fact passed that reduce protections against the exploitation of children in labor. There's a quote from a Republican lawmaker from last year. Do I remember his name or where he's from? No, I do not. But he said, we've gotten to a point where children have forgotten how to do what it is that we're training them for in the first place, which is work. Excuse me? On the one hand, I kind of like it when they say what they mean. On the other hand, what a thing to mean. Because the purpose of people isn't actually to labor. The purpose of human beings is not actually to labor. And the purpose of raising a child should not be primarily to make them a good laborer for someone else. We see the effects of this kind of thinking everywhere. I was telling some folks recently about my experiences teaching at some wildly different schools in Los Angeles County. I taught sex ed based on the Our Whole Lives curriculum, which we also teach here, and you will be seeing more about for next year. The Our Whole Lives curriculum, which is the gold standard for sex ed curriculums. I worked for an organization in LA that brought that curriculum to various schools around LA County. For the most part, those schools were one of two types of schools. The wealthiest, hippiest schools you've ever imagined, including one literally in a canyon in Calabasas, a school funded by Steven Spielberg, where they had their own organic garden from which their chefs prepared plant-based meals. A place where the first time I went, they said, well, we only do plant-based here. To me and a group of other Unitarian Universalists, as if we hadn't been doing plant-based since before they knew about it. Neither here nor there. Those students, when we would ask open-ended questions, and even when we'd ask no question at all, would take everything as an opportunity to investigate what they thought, what they knew, how this connected to what they had already learned. They would answer an open-ended question with, well, I think. The other types of schools that we worked at were charter schools in rougher neighborhoods in the LA area. When we asked open-ended questions to those kids, the answer was often, will you please just tell me what the answer is? When we asked them to think about what they wanted, about their values, the answer would often be, can you just tell me what the right thing is? And most of their teachers were great and trying to get them to engage and think, but some of their teachers thought, well, this is just how these kids are. It was really easy to see how people were getting used to disposing of those kids, how the expectation of them for their whole life had been, the point of view is to give somebody else's answer. The thing school wants from you is not for you to think or learn or develop. It is for you to figure out how to give the right answer. Schools like that, and the schools that poor kids across the country go to, work to produce good laborers for other people. People who don't think too hard, who don't question authority, people who are led really easily into things that may or may not be in their best interest. People who can't fight back very easily, who don't know how to talk to each other and develop consensus. People who are easy to lead into whatever is coming. The starkness of working in Calabasas one day and in Van Nuys the next made my head spin. Spent so much time trying to figure out how children who literally lived very close to each other, LA close, not real close, but LA close, could have such massively different experiences. It reminded me also of my own sort of flip-floppy childhood, going from Montessori school in the rich town nearby to public school in my hometown, which when I went there was ranked about 400 of 430 districts in Ohio, to private university, where most of my classmates entered with more college credits than I even realized you could enter college with. This back and forth of having been taught as a child to think and explore and play, to direct myself in my interests, to care about things deeply, and that I could learn whatever I wanted through whatever I was most interested in and passionate about at the time. I learned a lot of early math about dinosaurs. I formed my first environmental awareness organization when I was in second grade. And then I got in trouble a lot in public school because I didn't understand why I couldn't do what I wanted to do, why nobody cared what I thought about anything. And then I went to college, so beaten down by the experience of public school that it took me years to remember how to think again. So what do we think childhood is for? I'm clear that we don't think that people exist to labor. People certainly do labor, and labor is dignified. Your job matters, whether your job is working in a field or working in an office or working in a McDonald's or working in a way that you're not paid for at all. Labor, the things we do to make stuff happen, is valuable, regardless of its economic valuation. And much of our economic valuation of labor is remarkably wrong, just completely unrelated to reality. In Ohio, where I'm from, there are a lot of no longer factories. My life growing up was full of watching factories close because the rubber, steel, car economy that ran Northeast Ohio in the 70s and into the 80s was dead by the time I was a child, more so now. And seeing factories close always led to a fight between my father and I. I would say that's terrible. We would agree, that's terrible. That's hundreds of good jobs that people had. Good jobs like the one my grandfather had and the one my grandmother had that let them raise 8 children into adulthood, that let those children become, for the most part, the managers of similar factories, which let my cousins and I be much more able to go to college than any generation before us. Good jobs, we agreed, had been lost, but why? My answer was always greed, right? The CEO of that company, the board of that company, they decided they needed as much money as possible. And in doing that, they sent those jobs away to places where they could treat those workers worse, they could pay them less, where people were paying less attention to what they did to the environment. Remember also, I'm from Northeast Ohio, where our river has caught on fire more than once. And not just that time in the 70s. My dad would always counter that the CEOs and the boards, they deserved all of the money in the world because why would they do this otherwise? And I would say, what did they do? Did they build a car? That's an argument for another day. But the place that we would get is, do athletes deserve the amount of money that they get? And I recognize that I'm a little far afield from our topic, but I'm gonna get back to it. Give me a second. So here's the thing, right? Athletes make an absurd amount of money, but they make it with their physical bodies. You can only play football for so long. And it's a really small amount of time, provided that you don't get incredibly injured before you even get to there. You can play basketball for a little longer, but it's still only so long. You can play soccer and not make that much money in the United States, but still for only so long. Even singers, musicians, right? You can only tour for so long, unless you're Willie Nelson, in which case something else is true about you. But there's a big difference here, too. Well, several. One of those differences is that a CEO, or the guy who owns the football team, makes orders of magnitude more money than the very wealthy athlete. The guy who owns the record label makes orders of magnitude more than even the most famous celebrities. The wealthiest musicians and entertainers, who are at this time Jay-Z and Beyonce and Taylor Swift, make that money in part because they invested in the ownership model. Now, I don't think that any billionaire has gotten there through like ethical means. Don't hear me co-signing that, because I'm not. But it is different to own your own masters and have $1 billion than it is to own a bunch of other people's work and have several billions. Or to have stolen other people's ideas and turned it into a multi-billion-dollar. You follow me. I'm gonna get back to play now. The other difference is basketball stars inspire children to play. Famous musicians inspire children to play. When I was a child, I was really, really into ballet. And so through the winter months, my friends and I, all of our play was wrapped around putting together various versions of the Nutcracker on the playground. Sometimes I would watch performances. My parents were really into country music, so I really loved Crystal Gayle as a child. But so I would play with my cousins in the basement at my parents' house, and we would turn on our favorite country music songs and put on outfits from my various dance recitals, which were kept in a treasure chest for us to play with. And we would put on little performances. I come by all of this very honestly. What do we encourage children to think and do when the people who are held up highest are mostly thieves? How do we encourage our children to play? To play in ways that are creative and generative, that help them learn without restricting them too much. When I first lived in the Bay Area, I served as youth coordinator of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Redwood City. If you're not familiar with the shape of the Bay Area, Redwood City is way down on the peninsula, kind of south of where Google's headquarters is, if that gives you a clearer sense. The congregation was full of tech workers and their very nerdy children who I loved so much. I was supposed to lead a youth group every week, and I would make this ridiculous journey. I didn't have a car at the time. This ridiculous journey from where I lived in Berkeley across the BART to the end of the BART line, where I would pick up a rental car and drive to Redwood City, only to have none of these children show up because they were already wildly overprogrammed. They showed up the most when I said, you know what, if you come here, I will turn the lights off and you can take a nap. They showed up the most when I said, we're not going to have any programming. Come here and I will give you an hour where nobody can make you do anything. That was 11 years ago. And as far as I can tell, our young people have only gotten more programmed in the years since then. College admissions are an absurdity where the sorts of things that got you into a good school when I got into college don't even track to get into those same schools. And so kids, as they get older in particular, get more and more pressured into doing things that look like labor, into avoiding play. Maybe they play a sport, but they play it for competition more than for joy. Maybe they play an instrument, but if you aren't first chair, does anybody care? So what about what we do here? I have precious little control over the school systems or the college administration process. We have a little bit of control over what we do here, right? How do we treat children here? Well, one thing is we always want to invite our young people to participate in leadership, but we don't want to push it. So one thing I'm always trying to say to our youth and teenagers, oh, look, there's one now. Hi, Ellie. Is you can be as involved as you want to be. We want to hear your voice, but if you need a break, if you need this to be a place where you can rest, I am more interested in you having space than I am in you getting something done. That said, if I can give you something that's a relatively easy lift that looks really good on your college application, I will do that. I will make up a position for you. The other thing that I've been thinking about a lot is Seek. Obviously, I've been thinking about Seek a lot. Obviously, I think about Seek a lot in general. I hope that is obvious. I'm saying obviously, but maybe it isn't. I think about the model of Sunday school that we're still using and that has been used for decades and decades, which worked really well when children were less ridiculously programmed and families had more time. It's a model that looks a lot like public school curriculum. It builds week after week after week. This is a great way to educate people. It does work. The problem is, if the children show up already so fried from getting their brains crammed with information all week and doing 6 or 7 activities on top of that, Do they engage? And if those children can't come every week, like a lot of children can't, because they split time between families, because they have soccer on Sunday mornings sometimes, because life happens, and not everybody is here every week, what happens with that week that they miss? And do they learn to be together if we're focused on making sure they learn certain sets of facts? And I'm of, I don't know, about 6 minds on this. But my 2 biggest thoughts and the things I want us to think together about the most are the following. 1, thematic learning rather than curricular learning. We already have themes that we talk about each month, which we approach from a variety of angles. What does it look like if all of the Sunday school curricula have a relationship to our monthly themes, but are based around different projects that all think about the same things? Because if one week we drew pictures thinking about what a just and equitable world would look like, you're not left out the next week when we sing songs about it, right? And if you're older and you need a little bit of deeper thinking, if one week we watch a movie and it talks about bodily autonomy, and the next week we have a conversation about it, well, if you didn't see the movie, you're not actually left out in the conversation, right? And if the week after that we have a movie that's about climate change, well, you haven't lost anything in the in-between. So what if we work on themes? And then, if we're working on themes, when we change the shape of platform, which sidebar is on its way, and our young people start joining us at the end of platform to share what they've been up to, well, what they've been up to is related to what we've been up to. And we can have conversations. We can get to know our young people in a different way than we can if they're downstairs and we're upstairs and the stuff that we're doing has nothing to do with each other. So this is one piece. The other piece is something that I and some other folks around here have been calling feral church children. Feral congregational children. Making the congregation a space where our kids, at age-appropriate levels and ways with the consent of their parents, can run around and have fun and be safe. You see this sometimes on Sundays. I particularly love, there is a cohort of what I think of as middle school aged kind of femme of center children who will run around together, and if Lily Rose, who is 5, is around, she'll run around with them. And they're safe, and they're taking care of each other, and they're learning, right? The older kids are learning, okay, how do I help this smaller child be safe and interact? And the younger children are learning not only what it is to be in a group of older kids, but that they're safe. And they are all learning that this place is for them. And that this place cares about them, not as an outcome, not as a laborer, not as a number, but as a person. In a world where people increasingly want to talk about that kids need to work, one of the most truly radical, beautiful, values-oriented things we can do is give them space to play. And it has a second benefit. If that wasn't enough, though, that is enough. Children playing reminds us how to play. Reminds us of what it's like to have fun with your friends. reminds us that we too can let go of our task doing and have fun. That our task doing can in fact be fun. I don't know if you've ever seen children decide to wash the dishes. I know what. I have seen it. One of the gifts of my childhood was growing up relatively feral with a bunch of other children in a context where there would be 10, 15 of us running around at my grandparents' house by ourselves. And sometimes Grandma would make so much food, and then she would be really tired, and we would decide to wash the dishes. How that would happen usually would be that one of the older cousins would say, "There are a lot of dishes, and I bet you Grandma will be happier later if there aren't." And then we would organize ourselves and sing songs and laugh and splash each other while the dishes got done. It is remarkable how much fun you can have doing something that you hate. I hate washing dishes. Truly, deeply hate washing dishes. And yet, with 3 or 4 other people, I can have a really good time doing something I hate. I think the way children do things together can teach us a lot if we can let children do things the way children do things. So here is to feral congregational children. Here is to play. Here is to joy and finding it, even when it's really hard to find joy that particular day. Here is to the continued possibilities of life beyond what we've imagined, that is gloriously somehow running around in other people's bodies. I hope that we can be a space more and more where we honor our children by letting them be free, by letting them teach us as much as we teach them, by letting them rest when they need to and play when they need to, and teaching them what they need to know in ways that make sense to them, that connect to them, that honor that though they are newer to the planet and often smaller than us, they are still whole people on their way like the rest of us. Thank you.